It is the return of the 11 Dubcast. I'm George Eisner. With me is Deputy Editor at 11 Warriors, Dan Hope. Dan, how are you doing tonight as we begin the new era of the Dubcast here at 11 Warriors?
I'm doing great. I'm honored to be the first guest on the new edition of the 11 Dubcast. And I think we've got some exciting things planned for the future of the show, kind of reimagining what it's going to look like here as we go into the 2025 football season. And I'm really excited to be a part of that.
Absolutely. Well, since I took over for Andy Vance 2 years ago, my ultimate goal was to drive Johnny Ginter out of the show that he so graciously invited me to be on and to destroy our arch rival, the Real Pod Wednesdays. And I have succeeded in both, and I've now attained ultimate power here at 11 Warriors. No, I'm just kidding. I'm very honored that you and the rest of the beat would be willing to lend your credibility to us as we try to make a more aggressive pivot to video here. And I think that this is going to be a good format for us. What we're going to be doing going forward is, as opposed to the longer form podcasts that we've done since the Dubcast started all the way back in 2010, we're going to be doing more short increments, about 10 minutes, but we're going to be trying to get you a new piece every single day during the week. So Monday through Friday, you can expect these new short editions, the daily Dubcast, if you will, to post in tandem with Skull Session in the morning. So if you're an 11 Warriors fan, an Ohio State fan, you'll have that to look forward to for your morning routine going forward. So with that in mind, let's kick off the new era and let's take a look at today. I'm not sure if by the time this goes up with the Skull Session, it might be coming up a little bit later in the day, but you are, Dan, going to be posting your depth chart projection, or at least the updated version of it now that we're done with the first week of spring practice. So let me start based on your observations. What is the biggest surprise in terms of the offensive depth chart that you're foreseeing based on how you think things are shaking out as we're a few weeks out from the season now?
Well, I don't know if it's a surprise, but I do think that just in terms of the quarterback position that, of course, everybody wants to know about, I do think that Julian Sayin is the leader in that competition. Not that that's big, shocking, breaking news, but I would say, and for people who read my practice reports last week, you'd probably kind of see the progression of it where, the first couple days, I felt like things were pretty close. I didn't really feel like either quarterback really made a move. I felt like on Saturday, which was by far the most interesting of the practices to watch because they went for over 2.5 hours. They did full team 11 on 11. They had the pads on. It was just a more intense, more competitive practice. I thought Julian really shined in that setting, kind of like we saw in the spring game where I thought, a lot of the spring, I thought you could definitely make the argument that Lincoln Keenholz did look like the better quarterback. When the lights came on in the spring game, Julian was a better quarterback. And I think that was the case again on Saturday. So not to put too much stock into a couple of different practices / scrimmages, but we all know this is a guy who was the number one quarterback in the recruiting class of 2024. If all things are equal, a tie is probably going to go to him. And I think seeing what I saw over the course of the first few days of camp, to see him get incrementally better each day, it was kind of like what we saw with Will Howard last year.
That's what I was going to ask you is, did it remind you of how Will Howard kind of separated himself from the pack relative to the previous spring, where it was still kind of a where are they going to go situation at quarterback between him and Devin Brown?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, people probably remember from last year that in the spring, I was kind of pumping the brakes on Will Howard, like, I'm not really liking what I'm seeing here. And then in preseason camp, it was like day one, he still looked kind of meh, and I was worried. And then last year, we got to watch the first 4 practices. And like day 2, 3, and 4, you saw a clear jump from Will Howard where it's like, okay, this guy's going to be the starting quarterback. And I don't know what I would say Julian did quite that the past couple of days, but I do think I came out of those free open practices saying, I do think Julian Sayin is going to be the starting quarterback. I don't necessarily think the competition is over yet, but I do think that Julian is he's in that pole position. And I would say, comparing it to the Kyle versus Devin competition, Garrett Hodge and I were talking about this on Saturday as well. I feel like this competition is in a better place than that competition was, because I right now personally at this juncture of preseason camp would be more confident with either Julian Sayin or Lincoln Keenholz than I would have been at this juncture with either Kyle McCord or Devin Brown in 2023. So I think both of these guys are further ahead than where Kyle and Devin won that season. And I think Ohio State could win with either of these guys. But I think if you just look at what they're doing from a passing perspective, I think Julian is more advanced as a passer, and that's likely going to win him this job.
Okay, interesting. What about on the defensive side of the ball? Any surprises there in terms of your projections for who's going to be starting or who's going to play more of a depth role?
Well, the one change I made in my lineup projection between the last time I did one of these and this projection in terms of starters is at strong safety. At the end of spring, I put Malik Hartford as the starting strong safety because in the spring we had seen Malik take more first team reps than we saw Jalen take. Now I have Jalen McClain as my projected strong safety because being out there on Saturday, they both took a good amount of reps with the first team defense, but Jalen took most of those first team reps at the strong safety position. He was also just named an Iron Buckeye on Friday, which is often telling. Now, granted, Lincoln Keenholz was named an Iron Buckeye too, and I have Julian Sayin as our projected starter, so it's not foolproof, but typically those guys who are Iron Buckeyes are guys who are going to play big roles. Jalen McClain's a guy we saw play really well in spots last year. Now, the thing that's interesting is we've also seen Caleb Downs play a lot of nickel in these first few practices. So that's the interesting wrinkle in all this is, do we see Caleb Downs play a lot of nickel this year? Because if so, that would open the door for then Malik Hartford to play more at free safety and Jalen McClain to be that starting strong safety. And I think that might be part of why they're moving toward Jalen McClain at strong safety, is because then you can prepare Malik Hartford to play free safety when you move Caleb Downs around the formation. So it's kind of an interesting spot in the secondary where I think you have three guys who are for sure starters in Caleb Downs, Davison Igbinosun, and Jermaine Matthews. I think the other two spots are still a little bit more up in the air. And I think some of it could come down to, I think you've got three guys who are most likely to make up that lineup between Jalen McClain, Malik Hartford, and Lorenzo Styles Jr. And I think some of it could come down to who do they think are the two best players between those three. And that, along with obviously the fact that you're going to play Caleb Downs where you think he can make the biggest impact, but some of where he plays could also be determined by, okay, is Lorenzo Styles Jr. a better nickel than Malik Hartford is a safety, or vice versa? So the good news is I think they've got a lot of pieces in that secondary. At corner as well, you got guys like Aaron Scott, Devin Sanchez, Bryce West. They've got a lot of pieces there in that secondary that they can move around and do some different things with. And I think Matt Patricia is certainly going to want to do that. But if I'm sitting here today and predicting what I think the depth chart will be, the starting lineup will be in that secondary, I'd go Davison Igbinosun and Jermaine Matthews at outside corner, Lorenzo Styles at nickel, Caleb Downs at free safety, Jalen McClain at strong safety.
All right. Last question. So, last year I think was an interesting year relative to the history of platooning we've seen at running back in Ohio State football. Typically hasn't really worked out too well. I still have nightmares about the numbers that J.K. Dobbins could have had if he didn't have to have that timeshare with Mike Weber all the way back in, I think it was like 2017. So last year, we were very grateful to see both Quinshon Judkins and Travion Henderson finish as 1,000-yard backs for this team. It ended up working out very well. It's obviously going to be hard. It's hard enough to replace one top-level running back that ends up going within the first two rounds of the NFL draft, let alone two of them. This year, we're working with James Peoples and C.J. Donaldson. Those are your two guys projected at the top of the depth chart. That's who most people were assuming were going to be in there. Maybe Bo Jackson works himself into that pair and a spare equation in some way, shape, or form. But relative to the distribution of carries that we saw last year between Judkins and Henderson, do you see a similar split between those two guys at the top of the depth chart going into this season? Or do you think they're going to lean more heavily on James Peoples than perhaps they did one guy last season?
I do expect a similar timeshare. And I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that we're in this new world of a college football playoff where you're hoping to play 16, 17 games. You want both those guys to be fresh at the end of the year. And we saw that last year in the CFP. Travion Henderson and Quinshon Judkins were playing their best football in December and January. And you think back to past years where Travion struggled with injuries. If he didn't have that Quinshon Judkins to take some of that workload off his plate during the regular season, maybe we don't see Travion Henderson score a 75-yard game-changing touchdown in the Cotton Bowl. So I do think the goal is going to be to manage everybody's carries again this year, split things fairly evenly between James Peoples and CJ Donaldson. Now, if one of those guys clearly proves to be better than the other, and that could go either way, because James Peoples, I think he's likely to be the top back in this room, but he's still unproven. He only played a little bit last year. CJ Donaldson, I think you look at the way he's changed his body, you look at all the talent he's had around him, there's reason to believe he's going to be able to make a big jump from where he was at West Virginia, but he's still got to do that. So there's a lot more projection with these two than there was last year with Travion and Quinshon already being established stars going in. But I think if both of these guys are what they think they can be, I think you will see the two of them splitting carries fairly evenly, getting the bulk of the reps. I think the question also is, could a Bo Jackson or even an Anthony Turbo Rogers make it a three-man rotation? Will Ohio State expand its rotation if one of those freshmen proves they belong on the field right away? I think if I'm predicting how it will go right now, at least in that game against Texas, I would expect it'll be James Peoples gets the start, CJ Donaldson splits carries with him, and it's probably pretty much a 50-50 split between those guys. As the season progresses, that could certainly evolve, both in terms of does one of those two guys separate himself from the other, and does one of those freshmen, you'll get more opportunities to play against Grambling and Ohio and some of those other teams. Can one of those guys make a move to where then Carlos Loughlin and Ohio State trusts them to get more carries in high leverage situations?
All right. Well, it'll be interesting to see what shakes out over the next 4 weeks going into the Texas game. The season's right around the corner, and I'm grateful, Dan, that we have you and the rest of the beat to keep us informed on what's changing around in practice, and appreciate your perspective. Thank you very much. So we'll be back ideally tomorrow and in the days ahead during the weeks coming forward with more insight here on the Dubcast from Dan Hope and other members of the beat. But for Dan, I'm George Eisner. Thank you very much for tuning in, and we'll be back soon. Take care, folks.